He had only been living alone for 3 months when he first noticed her, the woman who lived just one floor above, the one who always seemed to glide rather than walk, the one who wore dresses that whispered against her legs and shoes that clicked with a delicate authority against the old wooden stairs. Her name was Claire, and she had an aura about her that made even the most mundane encounters, gathering mail, unlocking a door, feel like something rehearsed and inevitable. She must have been around 40, though her posture and smile had the confidence of someone who had long ago stopped caring what age meant. He, on the other hand, was 20 and carried his youth like a new suit that didn't quite fit, fresh to the city, fresh to loneliness, fresh to the aching silence that filled his apartment at night like water seeping under a locked door. He had seen her once standing on the balcony with a glass of wine, not looking at the street but gazing inward, it seemed as if the world below had long since lost its novelty, and that image lingered in his mind like the afterimage of staring at a flame, until one Sunday afternoon, when he was returning with a bag of groceries and fumbling with his keys, he heard her voice above him, soft but commanding, like velvet brushing against stone. "Excuse me," she said, leaning over the railing, a strand of dark hair falling against her cheek, "would you mind giving me a hand with something?" And he, blinking up into the sudden sun of her smile, found himself agreeing before he even understood what she wanted. Dropping his groceries with a clatter inside his door, he bounded up the stairs, 2 at a time, heart knocking painfully against his ribs, and she stood there, holding the door open with her hip, barefoot, in a simple gray dress that made her seem at once fragile and unassailable. She gestured him inside without ceremony. The apartment smelled faintly of jasmine and old books, and he saw immediately the object of her request. An antique-looking dresser, half-assembled, lay like a defeated beast in the middle of the living room. "I can't seem to manage it," she said, a touch of mockery in her tone, as if daring him to succeed where she had failed, and so he knelt, fumbling with screws and dowels, acutely aware of her presence hovering nearby, of her quiet breathing, of the way she watched him, not with impatience but with something closer to amusement. When he finally managed to set the dresser upright, she clapped her hands once, a soft, childlike sound, and said, "You're stronger than you look," and he flushed, feeling both foolish and proud, and then, instead of showing him to the door, she asked if he would stay for coffee, her hand lightly brushing his arm as she passed him toward the kitchen, a touch so brief it might have been accidental if not for the way she glanced over her shoulder to catch his reaction. He stayed sitting stiffly on the velvet couch while she moved around the kitchen with the unhurried grace of someone who knew she was being watched. When she returned, carrying 2 cups and setting them carefully on the low table between them, she tucked one leg beneath her, curling into the corner of the couch with a sigh that seemed to erase the years between them, making him feel not younger, but somehow her equal. As they talked, or rather, as she talked and he listened, he learned little about her in concrete terms, only that she had been married once, unhappily, that she worked in publishing, whatever that meant, that she had lived in this building for 6 years and yet had no apparent friends or visitors, that she preferred red wine to white, that she liked thunderstorms and despised small talk, and by the time the clock on her mantel struck 6, he realized with a start that hours had passed, that the light outside was turning syrupy and slow, and that he didn't want to leave. She must have seen that hesitation flicker across his face because she smiled then, slow and secretive, and said, "You don't have to go," and he didn't, not that evening, nor the next, nor many evenings after that, for what began as a favor with a piece of furniture became something far more intricate, far more dangerous. She drew him upward, both literally and metaphorically, into her world, into the thick, perfumed air of her apartment where time seemed to lose its shape, where the windows were always half covered with sheer curtains and the lamps were dimmed to a perpetual twilight, where she read aloud from novels he had never heard of, her voice a low hum that curled into his gut and made him dizzy, where sometimes she would simply stand close enough for him to smell the clean, sweet scent of her skin and then walk away, leaving him trembling in the emptiness she created. He was caught, of course, trapped not by force but by invitation, an invitation he could never bring himself to decline. Some part of him knew, even then, that he was no longer entirely free, that every time he climbed those stairs he surrendered something invisible but vital, some small piece of his autonomy, yet he climbed anyway, each time hoping. And she seemed to sense exactly how tightly he was wound, how much he would endure for the smallest scraps of her attention. Sometimes she would summon him with the smallest of excuses, a jar she couldn't open, a light bulb that needed changing, a book she thought he might like, and other times, she would simply leave her door ajar, a silent signal that he had permission to enter, that he was wanted. And when he did, when he stepped into her domain, it was as though the outside world ceased to exist, as though the two of them were the only inhabitants of a dream stitched together by candlelight and whispered conversation. She never kissed him, not at first, never touched him in any overtly intimate way, but she didn't need to. Her power lay in the spaces between, in the ache of anticipation, in the soft, knowing smiles, in the way she would lean close enough for her breath to warm his ear. And then drift away, leaving him starving for more, and he, in his naivete, believed he could endure it forever, believed he could coexist with that exquisite hunger without ever being satisfied, believed he could remain the eager boy at the foot of her throne without eventually demanding something in return. But of course, desire is a corrosive thing, and soon the weight of his yearning began to show. At the end of an evening, in the way his eyes betrayed him every time he looked at her, until one night, as rain lashed the windows and the power flickered and died, she lit a dozen candles and beckoned him to sit beside her on the couch, closer than he had ever dared, and in the heavy hush that followed, she reached out and touched his face, her fingertips tracing the line of his jaw with unbearable gentleness, and he closed his eyes, shuddering under the simple, shattering pleasure of it. When he opened them, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, something between pity and possession, and she said, almost sadly, "You don't know what you're asking for," but he did, or at least he thought he did, and he reached for her. Reckless and desperate, and when she didn't pull away, when she allowed his hands to frame her face, to draw her closer, it felt like stepping off a cliff into warm, bottomless water. She kissed him then, slowly, thoroughly, tasting him, and from that night onward, he did not return to his own apartment except to gather clothes and essentials. He lived in her space, in her rhythm, in her rules, sleeping tangled in her sheets, waking to the soft scrape of her fingers through his hair, existing in the narrow, intense orbit of her attention. And though he sometimes wondered about the outside world, about his old life, those thoughts were thin and insubstantial compared to the dense, vivid immediacy of life with her. She taught him things without teaching, simply by expecting, by demanding him with the smallest tilt of her head or the softest murmur. She made him better and worse all at once, sharpening him, addicting him to a kind of intimacy that was more than physical, that was psychological, spiritual. He lived for her approval, for the moments when her eyes would light with pride or pleasure, and he would do anything to earn them, anything to avoid disappointing her. But of course, nothing lasts forever, and over time, he began to feel the edges of the world pressing back in, the texts from friends unanswered, the missed calls from his family, the creeping realization that he was losing himself in her, and perhaps that was her intention all along. Perhaps she needed someone who would dissolve into her life without resistance, who would become another exquisite object on her shelves. But he was young, too young to surrender completely, and so the tensions grew, unspoken but palpable, until one night, after a trivial disagreement about something he couldn't even remember now, she simply said, "Maybe it's time you went home," and though the words were soft, they were a severing, a slicing away of the invisible thread that had bound him to her. He stood there, stunned, wounded, as she turned back toward the window, the same window where he had first seen her standing alone, and he realized that he had never really belonged to her, not in the way he had hoped. He had only been a guest in her life, a diversion, a beautiful, burning summer that would leave its scorch marks on his heart long after it was over. He stumbled downstairs, back into his own apartment, into the cold, unfamiliar quiet of his own life, and though he could still smell her on his skin, still hear the phantom echo of her laughter, he knew it was over, knew he had been both blessed and cursed by loving a woman like her, a woman who lived just one floor above, but who existed in an entirely different universe, a universe he had glimpsed, tasted, and ultimately been cast out from. And yet, even now, years later, when he hears the soft creak of a stair or catches the scent of jasmine on a breeze, he feels a sharp, aching pang deep in his chest, a reminder that once, for a little while, he had lived in a dream woven by a woman who lived on the third floor.